I'm sorry.
That's okay. Thank you. Hello. To echo Dr. Rowe, it is daunting to speak after one's elders. However, partially because of the brilliance in which they describe the situation, but also because I have all these notes about responses I want to give, and now I have to stay focused on my original remarks. I'll tell you a little bit about myself very briefly. My PhD is in social psychology. I had the honor of being postdoc for Dr. Grills, but my background is also in critical media studies. So I identify as a media psychologist. For people who are not familiar with the term media psychology, it is effectively how media affects the way we think. So I focus on concepts of identity and how does media affect the way we think about ourselves and each other. And not just the media we consume, but also the media we create. I teach at the Newhouse School at Syracuse University, which is one of the top communication schools in the country. All the students are required to major in some applied field. So I'm teaching advertising students, I'm teaching journalists, I'm teaching TV, radio, and film, I'm teaching magazine, I'm teaching photography students, right? Students of all public communications. However, I teach in the theory department, even though the students are not allowed to major in theory. However, all students have to take theory classes, and more importantly, all students have to take my class, which is race and gender in the media. It's nice to have a required class, right? Because whenever you're teaching these things, you're pretty much teaching to the choir, right? You're teaching to students who want to talk about these things. But at Newhouse, all students are required to talk about these things. And at the start of every semester, we go around the room and I ask them, why are you taking this class? And I learned in the first semester that it's a requirement is not a valid answer. Because they are very easy to give that one. So I stop and ask them, why is this a requirement? Right? We didn't just make it a requirement to force you to take another class. Why is this a requirement? And then they start to understand that the world is changing and the way they talk and the way they communicate is changing. I got a whole bunch of ugly looks the other day when I told them that I don't care who your audience is. Your audience is everyone. And as media scholars and media producers, you need to think about how everyone will be affected by your messages. So the class itself, and I would just like to describe the class to you briefly. I will also point out that the school is 80% white. Right? So I'm teaching mostly white students. It is a private school, so it is expensive. So the conversations are often limited, and it is literally my job to stand up there and expand them. So the class itself is structured around a wide variety of social groups, right? We're talking about race, we're talking about gender, we're talking about sexuality, we're talking about class. I tend to start the class with the American dream and the psychological processes that bring us to the American dream. I like to show a little Scarface, only because for those of you who remember, the slogan of that movie is, he loved the American dream with a vengeance. And I talk about how the American dream is taught as something to be valued, but there are certain ways to go about it for certain groups. And the minute we deride one group's attempt to achieve the American dream, then we have categorized that entire group as inherently problematic. So I teach from a psychological perspective, which is really valuable in my opinion, because it encourages students not to think about their intentions, but rather the environment in which they were raised and how that subsequently creates cognitions that they are not necessarily in control of. We talk about characteristics, categories, groups. We talk about stereotypes, attitudes, and behaviors, and specifically how all of these things are different. My number one message to them that I repeat probably every other week is, I need you to be better than your brain. We are human beings. We are predisposed to do what makes us feel comfortable. We are predisposed to continue the system in which we were raised and the system as the status quo. So in order to interrupt that system, I need you to be better than your brains. And what we do in class, it's a little bit of history, it's a little bit of psychology, it's a little bit of critical media studies, and it's a little bit current events. On that note, I find myself having to teach a ridiculous amount of history in a week. Every week, right? We're talking about all of class in a week. We're talking all of Black history in a week, all of Latino history in a week. And it's ridiculous and it's obscene. Having said that, I also come to learn what the students don't know. And I'll point out that I too am Guyanese, and I start class off with describing who I am. And I ask them, how many of you have heard about Guyana? In a class of 30, 2 raised their hands. When I asked, where is Guyana? 1 person raised their hand. When I called on him, he said West Africa. So this is what I'm tackling. And I make a point to say this because I would really like to tell you about some of the strategies I use in class to engage in these conversations and help students be a bit more critical, not only of the media they consume, but also the media they create. So I talk about the history. I ask them to pay attention to the history, right? We show many different media mistakes, for lack of a better term, right? How many of you are familiar with LeBron James on the cover of Vogue in 2006, right? I'm seeing a lot of nods, I'm seeing a lot of hands. In short, it looked like an echo of the King Kong poster, straight echo. But more importantly, nobody at any point in the shoot, in the editing of the photo, in the publication of the magazine, nobody stopped to say, this might be a problem. Which means either A, nobody knew it was a problem, or B, nobody spoke up. So one of the first assignments, and actually repeated assignments, I have my students do this 3 times, is to pick an artifact and explain to their immediate supervisor or their media team, whoever's creating it, why this is problematic. And that's more than just saying, oh, this is racist. I think my professor would say this is racist. It's about explaining the history, the process that you've learned in this class to a lay audience, to someone who has not taken this class. And it's very easy, especially when you start paying attention, to notice the trends, right? We see that although Black folks are overrepresented in media, they're about 12 to 13% of the American population and about 17% of television characters. Even though Black folks are overrepresented in media, they're consistently stigmatized or presented as criminals, as athletes, and as musicians, as entertainers or criminals, period, right? So to see that is one thing. To describe why that's problematic, well, Martins and Harrison have demonstrated that long-term viewing of stereotypical television has a negative effect on the self-esteem of women and people of color. Here's a study for you, right? To be able to explain those things to lay people who don't want to think about these things. That's how you need to start disrupting, especially as media producers, right? Another example, one of my friends who is a producer on a Super Bowl commercial, I don't know if any of you saw this, it's called The Miracle Stain by Tide. It's hilarious. He eats a nacho, it falls on his shirt, it's Joe Montana. Everybody freaks out, it means the 49ers are gonna win. Long story short, the wife washes the shirt because she's a Ravens fan. This friend of mine who was a producer on it took the casting to his boss, it's a Black couple, and the boss said, this isn't gonna work. We need an all-American couple. And he said, but they're all-American. They're heterosexual, they're high class, right? Like, we could talk about all the other trappings of what it means to be all-American, but all of those things were fine. But the boss said, no, people are not gonna respond well to a Black couple. We need an all-American couple. And he pushed him to say, you mean a white couple. And I use that as an example. This is what we need to do every day, is to encourage people to reflect on the processes in which they are coming to the things that they say without a second thought, because that's what's normal, because that's the hegemonic normal. To disrupt it and question it every day in a respectful sense, right? Because you can't call your boss racist and expect to keep your job when you're like 2 weeks into the position. How do we talk about this? How can we disrupt this? How can we say, maybe this LeBron cover, we should pick a different image? I also want to mention explicitly about the role of social media. When we talk about the power of media, we can talk about the power of social media to generate movements, right? We can talk about Black Lives Matter, we can talk about Arab Spring, we can talk about Occupy, and we can talk about how Occupy, dissipated over time as well. But I really want to talk about social media as changing the narrative. And all of us have the opportunity to now tell our own narratives, our robust, our dynamic, our emotional narratives, that it's not just relying on mainstream content. We're not just relying on a TV show to tell our narratives for us. And we can see instance after instance where a social media individual rises up to become mainstream, to get coverage, to talk about unique narratives and unique experiences that are above and beyond the stereotype, which is supposed to be what sells. So examples like Issa Rae, I believe now has for Awkward Black Girl. If you haven't watched Awkward Black Girl, it's really fun. She's got a pilot deal on HBO. We talk about Tyler, the Creator. We could talk about Awesomely Lovey, right? All of these bloggers and vloggers and social media activists are changing the way we think and the way we talk about race, racism, Blackness, history, current events, all of these things. And I encourage you, each of you, to think about using your own social media, not just as, and I don't want to say instead of, right? Because I use my social media to vent my frustrations a lot. But also to construct a cohesive, valuable narrative that's not just valuable to your outside audiences, but also to you. For I gave a TEDx talk, you should totally watch it, on the psychology of selfies, and looking at how selfies can be a self-esteem intervention to create an image that you like of you, no matter what is supposed to be perfect or what is supposed to be pretty or what is supposed to be filtered, that we can capture our own narratives, our own images, and make them valuable every day. We don't need to wait for some CEO at the top of some media conglomerate to decide that that's okay.
30 seconds, Dr.
So my encouragement to you would be to take control of your own narrative given the tools that you have in your pockets right now. Thank you.
Thank you all. I haven't received any questions, so, great, coming up. And as you do that, I'd like to ask the panel members if there are one or two things that you heard during this conversation that was quite thought-provoking, which also informs the action agenda. Let's begin with that, and then I'll look at the questions as we go forward. Were you listening to each other?
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the second half of your question.
Sure. Is there anything that your colleagues mentioned that was really thought-provoking, which would inform the action agenda for the folks in the circle deliberations? Dr. Dupree?
Yeah, no, I have a whole list.
Okay. Great.
Okay. I was thinking about mentioning this, but then I thought it would derail, so I kind of want to elaborate. And it's on the issue of intersectionality. And I talk a lot about intersection. Is this on? Okay, cool. Oh, sorry. I talk a lot about intersectionality in my classroom, right? That we are not, at any given time, just one group, right? We're not only Black at one point, or only a woman, or only an American, or only a professor, or only an activist, right? At any given time, all of these things intersect. And I describe this explicitly because, And if I can be a little emotionally open, why not? This is a safe space, right? Yeah, we're good? Okay. There have been a lot of occasions where I have questioned my own blackness. I've questioned my own blackness and whether or not I should have attended that Black grad conference in psychology the very first time I met Cheryl Grills. Am I going to be Black enough for this space? Right? My father is mostly Black, and my mother is mostly Chinese, and I identify as Guyanese by way of New York. Period. I tell my students that I am multiracial and monoethnic. And then we unpack what race and ethnicity are. But I say this because the idea that Blackness is diluted because of other identities that we might share, and we can go back to civil rights, ain't I a woman, right? That there's two things happening, and because I'm identifying as a woman does not mean I am identifying as less Black. When it was Hillary versus Obama in 2008, a buddy of mine made a joke. He's like, oh, Charisse, what's more important to you, your Blackness or your womanness? And I'm like, I'm gonna let you slide because I love you, but that's not cool, right? Because those things exist at the same time. And I think, and so I was also doing a residency at Burrell Communications this summer, and I'll keep it quick so other people can respond. I was doing a residency at Burrell Communications this summer, which is one of the first Black-owned ad agencies. I also assigned Burrell's Brainwashed in my book, in my class. But the concept of what Blackness is differed individual to individual, generation to generation. There was one girl there from, well, in the interest of anonymity, there was a girl from Africa, an African country, and other people didn't understand her Blackness. And they kept putting other things, oh, you're mixed. She's like, no, I'm Black. Oh, you're from South Africa. No, I'm not, right? Like trying to explain her Blackness. And so I also love DeRay's phrase, I love my Blackness and yours. And I think it's really important, especially when we talk about alternative concepts of Blackness, intersectional Blackness, LGBT Blackness, international Blackness, mixed race Blackness, all of those things, that it's valuable to hear and incorporate the perspectives of all Black people, which is why I was so excited to be here, is that Blackness is bigger than one definition. Blackness is an experience. Blackness is a community. All of you can give me a different definition of what your Blackness is as well. But it is one thing that's a stick for me, and I did want to mention it, especially as West Indian, and I'm doing a chapter right now on how Caribbeans talk about race and how that affects multiracial ethnic identity development in the Caribbean. And a lot of them voice the idea that because I acknowledge my mother, if my mother is Chinese, somehow that means I'm less Black and I can't have that conversation. And it's a point that I wanted to bring up. Thank you.
Thank you. We have some very provocative questions here, so I want to make sure your audience gets a chance to weigh in. Dr. Streets, there are two directed at you. One is specifically on our trauma-informed ministries, also including African religious/spiritual ideas, practices in their work. And the second question is, I'm interpreting this as, have you published a book on trauma-informed ministry to lead to sort of a further question on what would the action agenda look like for the clergy in the communities from which you know very well?
The first question, absolutely. We have to have a multi-perspective, a multidiscipline approach that reflects and honors the diversity of our own experience as Black people. Some of you are familiar with a book many years ago, Mabibi's book on African spirituality, for an example. The reality is, in my experience as a clergy, we may think people are practicing and believing according to the way we lay it out in our sermons and in our Bible studies. But the real practice at home might be a lot different. Or it may include what we say, but other things.